So, like we said, we have an idea of grout and we have an idea of the big pieces. So the grout, we can basically handle these two pieces as those two distinctive groups in terms of both fracturing and simulation. And I guess what I mean is these big pieces, we're going to want to subdivide these. We're going to want to subfracture these big pieces so that they move as one big chunk as the frame begins, as the simulation begins, and then they'll fall apart themselves towards the end. Maybe they'll break because they hit something, or maybe we'll just force them to break. Now, these grout pieces, we're not going to ever probably clump them together. We're just going to shatter them straight up. We also will probably shatter them in maybe a different way because they're going to yield a lot more pieces as we subfracture all of these small pieces than the big ones are. All this is to say that we're going to want to specify two groups of objects now. The big pieces that need to make glue constraints and subfracture and all move as one, and we want to make grout fractures, which are going to be these smaller fractures that are going to have lots of slicing and dicing along the surface to make lots of little pieces along the surface. And we'll even want them to begin to simulate earlier so that, if you can imagine, we'll want all the little pieces here to start going first, and then we'll want them to creep along here before the big piece starts moving. So we're going to want to specify some attributes that are unique to the grout. So again, all that is to say that we want to make a group for the grout, make a group for the big pieces. And the way we're going to do that is basically find out how big they are. And we'll choose some arbitrary threshold to say, if your volume is greater than this, you're a big piece. If your grout is greater than that, you're a small piece. So the for loop fortunately runs pretty fast. This apparently is the weird piece it's looking at now. Let's just find an interesting piece to work on when I'm building out a for loop. It's nice to say, turn single pass on, find some cool looking piece. Like here's a cool looking piece, and let's just work on that one. And then when we're done, we'll turn single pass back off. So how do we find the volume of a given piece? There's a lot of ways. Probably the most straightforward way is to use the measure, which literally will say for every polygon on here, or every triangle really, every two triangles if it's a square, find the volume. And so how can one polygon, like this, how can this one flat polygon have a volume? Well, really what's going to happen is, let's say if we delete that polygon for a second and just look at it. Oops, I did not mean to delete the node. Let's say we delete this polygon and we isolate it. The volume, as calculated by this measure here, is basically going to say, imagine a tetrahedron whose base is the triangle and whose top is this center point specified here. So just to illustrate this, I'm going to drop down a tridivide, which is a way of subdividing triangles. It'll basically just make a point in the middle. There we go. So a tetrahedron essentially is this shape. It's a pyramid that has the base, which is the polygon itself, and then again this tridivide, or rather this the measure here, whatever this point is, which we're going to make that the center of the object. It's actually computing the volume of this whole thing. So the polygon's volume is all of the area bounded by the initial triangle and then all the stuff that leads up to that point. So the idea being that if every single polygon in here is one of these tetrahedral shards, adding them all up will give you the approximate volume of the whole thing. So we don't need any of that, but that's what's happening underneath. And I don't know how that became TR, but there we go. So volume, let's just use the centroid. Let's just use the center of the object. Easy to imagine. And as usual, it's this dx, dy, dz thing. So dx, dy, dz. And you'll see Oops, so close. You'll see that now every single one of these polygons in here, and these primitives, if you will have a volume. Like that. Some of them will be negative. Some will be positive. Cool. All you need to do then is add them up. Take an attribute promote, say go from primitive to detail, and say volume. And we say sum. So now we'll have a new detail attribute, which is the entire volume of that piece, 2,285. Now when we pack all this stuff right after this, we're going to want to transfer that attribute up. So I'm going to say preemptively, let us promote this, or rather really demote this back down to primitive. Because if we keep it as a detail, every loop, it will basically, it's going to make a new detail for every loop, and then they're all going to be crushed together. It won't work on the other side of the loop. So really, we need to go from, in here, we need to go from detail to primitive volume. So now every polygon, it's going to say the same volume, which at first doesn't really make sense, except when we actually do all of them like this, and it'll run super fast, bada-bum. And I'm just going to go back to flat shaded so we don't have to see that nonsense. Now when we assemble this, we're just going to say, hey, create a name, pack it now. We have 2,936 pieces, and transfer that volume. And because every single polygon in a given piece has the same volume in a given piece, that piece's volume will come through. So now you can see everybody has these different volumes. Cool. So that's about all we have to do to determine the volume. Pretty easy and very fast. Even though it's a for loop going over thousands of pieces, still obviously super fast. So let's immediately use that information. Let's make another split, our good friend, and let's give him a parameter that will be the threshold at which we say, you're a big piece and you're a small piece. Because remember, that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, what are the big pieces that are going to be split off to the left side? What are the small pieces that are going to be considered grout that is split off to the right side? So I'm just going to use this thing. I'm going to copy it immediately, copy parameter, and say, if your volume is greater than that number up there. And this is going to be, we have to change this to points, because volume, or actually volume is a primitive thing, so we can actually keep it on primitive or guess. So as we increase this, you'll see pieces disappear. And that makes sense, because we're making it harder and harder and harder. We're making the threshold higher and higher and higher in order for it to go to the left side. Meanwhile, on the right side is where all the small pieces are going, as you can see here. And that's what we want. These are those interstitial areas. These are the areas between the big pieces. So what we want to do here is keep bumping this up and up and up until we start to lose the big pieces. So far, I don't see anything happening bad like that. And now that might be too much. So we lose that piece in the middle there and the piece in the bottom. I don't want to lose those pieces. I don't want them to be considered grout. So I'm going to say, once we get to that, 341 seems to be it for me. It may be different for you. I have a feeling it'll probably end up being somewhere around 300 plus. And there you go. So now all this stuff is the grout. It's the stuff in between. And now all the stuff that's going to the left will be considered the so-called big pieces.